A Retirement Accounts Allocation Guide. You know, Lynch of the Magellan Fund once noted that people spend more time thinking about buying a toaster than they do about retirement. Meaning, does it have 2 or 4 slices? Can it do muffins? What colors does it come in? Whereas you have almost a half dozen types of accounts and literally thousands of vehicles with which you can invest in. First, a little clarification. People often confuse shelters versus vehicles, meaning the types of accounts versus the types of investments one can place in them. Stocks, bonds, ETFs, those are like mutual funds that trade like stocks. And likewise, before going any further, we should note you should think about this when you're a little bit younger, because if you start at the age of 20 instead of 30, you will double the amount at the end. And likewise, if you can just save 2% a year, no-load index funds, for example, it'll double again. Let's start with the shelters. Those are the types of accounts. You have your cash account, nominally, normally fully taxable, but you do get a unique savings there, and that is for a middle-class taxpayer. You often save about 9% on capital gains and on USA qualified dividends therefrom. There's a health savings account that allows you to use pre-tax monies, about $7,000 for a single, $15,000 for a family, and now it's no longer use it or lose it. If you're in the 1/3 bracket, allows you to pay for 50% more. Your home is a shelter, knowing that you do get a one-time exclusion of $250,000 if you're single and $500,000 if you're married. And it gets a big tax deduction. Then there are the IRA accounts, not redundant. The A stands for arrangement, and there's the traditional taxable going out, tax deduction going in, and the Roth, no tax either way. The traditional IRA account has no income limits if you do not have a pension. The Roth has more generous limits regardless. With the traditional, if you have a non-working spouse, they can still qualify using the Roth higher limits. And then, of course, there's your pension. A good idea even if the employer does not match it. Better if they do. There it's taxed at a deferred rate. Here's an example with a shortcut. If you have a product of 72 by the maturity and the yield, then you have something that's 1/2. And in this example, let's take 8%. As for the IRA accounts, everybody asks, which is better, the Roth tax-free or the traditional taxed in and out, noting no extra benefits on those capital gains or qualified dividends. So if you look at the math, it turns out if the terminal tax rate and the initial tax rate are the same, they give the same return, while noting you do set aside more funds with the Roth. The traditional IRA is treated just like a pension if you're not working. Mandatory requirements now are at the age of 73. And if you do get a better tax rate at the end, especially if you live in some of those states that don't charge an income tax, that's something to think about. Here's a chart I made showing that the difference is not as much the farther you go into the future. Let's do this again, but from the other point of view, from the vehicle, and where should we place them in which shelter? You typically have high-rated bonds. A good idea most people agree with is make those a fraction of your age as a percentage. Those would be probably best put in your IRA account because it saves the tax. If you have a tax-exempt bond of the same state, you can put that in your cash account. Do note federal bonds are not taxed by the states. If you have assets that might have capital gains or qualified USA dividend-bearing stocks, you only get that 9% savings in your cash account. Mini stocks and ETFs, those are mutual funds trading at stocks, have the ability to write covered calls, which is pretty safe. And you can do that in both your cash account and your IRA accounts. I wouldn't recommend reinvesting dividends because it screws up the even requirement of 100 shares for covered calls, and you don't diversify. Now you're going to get those mutual funds that have no load, index, almost no expense ratio, and those probably are best put in your pension account because you get the deferred tax rate. By the way, that Social Security, heads up on some specifics. Present value analysis, also longevity and ability to use it. Take Social Security the age of 67. And it is taxed in some dozen states. They're listed here. And heads up, the amount you get is based upon the last 10 years before you apply. Well, as we come to the end, let's go over the specifics associated with the IRA accounts. They do change. If you don't have a pension, the limits do not apply for the traditional. In the case of the Roth, they do have higher limits regardless, and you use those if you're looking at your traditional IRA for a non-working spouse.